Gen Z are those born between 1996 and 2010.
Another label for this generation, Zoomers.
The first generation to come of age in the era of the smartphone. We're just now beginning to get a better picture of what makes this generation unique.
This is 10 stats about Gen Z that churches should not ignore.
Well, hey there, and welcome to the Bro Church Tool Show. We're here to help you and your church navigate the biggest communication shift in 500 years. I'm Brady Shearer, your host. I'm joined as always by my co-host. We call him the Millennial Monk. It's Alexander Mills.
Hello, hello.
And today, we are chatting about 10 outrageously important statistics relating to Gen Z, but we're going to do it in a bit of a different format. We have each independently ranked these 10 statistics, unknowing the ranking of the other.
Yeah.
And we're going to go in reverse chronological order and figure out along the way where we think each of these statistics slots in relation to its importance to overall culture, but specifically to church. I'm going to let Alexander begin.
How charitable.
How charitable. Does that mean that I get to reveal my number one before him?
Yes.
Who can know? Who can know? This is like when you're on the playground and you're like doing eeny, meeny, miny, mo, and you're like, oh yeah, start with him.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Number 10, please.
So I just deleted all of my notes by accident. So thanks be to God for, nope, there they are. For iOS, for the shake to undo. Thank you, Lord.
Great start.
It's funny because
that's exactly what a millennial would do.
It's funny because this is not a bit. We truthfully have hidden these rankings from each other to the point where we sat down to record and had to go find our hidden notes. We couldn't find them.
We have our shared notes,
Yes.
but then we have our hidden notes.
Yeah, so I use the Apple Notes app. You're in Evernote. So they're safe and secure. But we ranked the same 10 stats about Gen Z. And in the 10 spot, so to me, the least notable is this statistic. And these statistics come from a few different sources. All of those sources will be linked in the show notes or the description of the YouTube video if you're watching. So the 10th and least important statistic, in my view, is that Gen Z are bringing back 90s and early thousands fashion trends and listening to the era's tunes. Now look, I know that for you and I, 90s, early 2000s, this is a time of sweet nostalgia, both in fashion and in culture, music. We share a lot of the same affinity for the same music, both inside the Christian circle and outside the Christian circle during that time. And yes, it is, I feel like a proud dad, watching these kids come up and start wearing the same things we used to wear and feel cool for the same reasons we used to feel cool when we were kids. And yes, listening to the same music. But as far as the relevancy to this generation and what this means to, the most existential matters of life, I put it in the 10 spot for me.
See, this is where you can tell this man, he doesn't really get it, right? He might be in beige as I am, but we're operating on different planes of existence right now. I obviously understand the Gen Zs. This stat comes from the Global Web Index. How many times are we going to call Gen Z kids? You're 2 years away from the cutoff.
Yeah, for those listening, the cutoff is 1996. That's the beginning of Generation Z, and I was born in 1993. Braid, you're 1991.
That's correct.
Yeah.
That's correct.
So you're a little bit safer.
So this comes from Global Web Index. They're saying here, while older generations generally tune into the music of the decade they grew up in, Gen Z are breaking that mold. Their top genre is hip hop or rap music, closely followed by 90s music, which for many, like we said, would have been released before they were even born. What makes this generation have a preference for listening to music that they didn't grow up with? The answer, according to the study, likely due to, like you said, nostalgia. As Gen Z faces various struggles in their late teens and early adulthood, searching for comfort and a coping mechanism, they've latched onto a simpler time, music during an era where social media and this pervasive influence of the internet did not yet exist. This also has been transitioning into fashion, 90s, early 2000s, glitter details, claw clips, halter tops.
What's the choker necklace? You've seen those around.
Those coming back. And of course, the big one, skinny jeans are dead, embracing relaxed fits. Which took me about 4 years to get through. I slowly went from skinny to slim to straight to relaxed. I haven't gone full baggy. I think I'm going to stop at relaxed, but I did eventually get there. And then another important note, for Gen Z, it's not just about the style, it's a whole vibe. Many feel that the era represents a carefree time that was about having fun, and with the stressful reality we've experienced in the last few years, it's no wonder Gen Z are nostalgic for a simpler time.
They might be right about that, actually.
In terms of shows, Seinfeld, I just want to make a big just call to action to all watching and listening. It is worth watching for both the fits and the funnies.
Really?
Because every single person in that show is getting a whole fit off. George Costanza, famously one of the most, loser characters in sitcom history. The man is dripped out. Kramer in the camp shirts, drip.
Yeah.
Jerry, he's got the perfect 90s jeans. He's tucking it in. Outstanding work.
When did we start bringing leather back? Leather had a moment back then.
Leather never went out. It's just different expressions of leather.
I haven't seen you express too much leather.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Well, I have been on the lookout for the perfect leather jacket for many a time, and I did not quite find one, but I did find one that has a leather type. It's almost, you know what it is? Do you remember those 90s starter jackets that had like the Charlotte Hornets?
Yeah.
It's kind of reminds me of that. It's a bit of a windbreaker.
Okay.
It is very on trend for spring. Now, I did crucify you a little bit for where you ranked this.
Where'd you put it?
So I have it at number 10. Because where we're going, it's not justifiable to put it any lower.
Yeah.
But to my personal ranking, number 1.
Proud of these kids, yeah.
All right, my number 9 is also from the Global Web Index. It says here, Gen Z's interest in environmental issues has decreased 11% year on year. Where did you have this?
I had this at number 8.
Number 8.
Yeah.
So similar spot to mine. And they're describing this as what the survey calls crisis fatigue. And this is interesting because I, as now, getting close to my mid-30s millennial, turning 33 next month, am really fascinated to see how our generation and our values and perspective and worldviews have shifted, it seems like, since our 20s. And typically this is something that we've seen historically. As generations get older, they become their worldviews change. But what we are seeing is that happen a little bit less so far with our generation relative to previous generations. And yet, it's almost like we're seeing that earlier with Gen Z because as it's described here, it's not that they don't care about these issues. It's that in the case of prioritization and mental bandwidth, it's just not something that they can prioritize because they have to focus on paying bills and job security and this cost of living crisis that we're going through. And they're like, hey, it's not that I don't care about this anymore. It's that I only have so much attention and so much value to put in different things, and it has to be elsewhere right now. And that's a fascinating insight into how we hold our values, right? How deeply held is a value if it gets sacrificed for just the logistics of everyday life?
Yeah, I spent some time thinking about this one, and you and I both had it kind of low on the list, and I'm sure as we get higher on our list, our listeners will learn and see why that these are still relevant, but maybe not the most important stats to consider about Gen Z. But I do think it is still there is something to be gleaned from the fact that their interest in environmental issues is decreasing, because it doesn't say that they're not concerned about it. And you'd see that if you click through and read some of this data that we've collected here, but they are concerned about it, but it's not the most pressing for them. And I think part of that is, we just acknowledge that it was 4 years ago that the coronavirus, swept the globe. And it seems to me that it's plausible that there are so many more pressing issues before Gen Z to be worried about, that the climate one is I know that this is a thing. I know that the earth is warming. I know that there's consequences to that, but that feels too big and
maybe still a bit too distant too.
Sure. And the recovery plan, too much work to occupy the most of my attention. Right now I'm stressed about A, B, or C. I've got all this other stuff going on, and this kind of slides down the scale of what they're worried about compared to someone like you or me who's a little bit older and have kids, or other millennials who are thinking about kids and thinking about the longevity of life that our kids are going to get to enjoy. So maybe that's why an environmental crisis would rank a little bit higher on the list of concerns for someone like you or me.
So I have a fascinating and really important addition to add to this data point that's not specifically relevant to this individual point, but everything we're talking about today, because there has begun a movement that pushes back a little bit against the conversation that we're having here at all. Some have suggested that this whole like millennials versus Gen Z, and this is what boomers are like versus Gen X, is actually like a little bit too much of pseudoscience to even really engage with. This comes from Pew, who I think took the step of removing certain labels on a bunch of their articles in response to what is described here. Quote, generational research has become a crowded arena. The field has been flooded with content that's often sold as research, but is more like clickbait or marketing mythology. There's also been a growing chorus of criticism about generational research and labels in particular. Labels perpetuate bias and stereotyping. In the workplace, age experts encourage leaders to eliminate using generational labels at all, which can create exclusion and disengagement. The trivial assignment of characteristics to age cohorts is misleading and can lead to generation bashing and finger pointing, creating mistrust, disengagement, and talent loss. This is what Pew says. They'll only do generational analysis when we have historical data that allows us to compare generations at similar stages of life. And that is the key point. What we often see, and this is useful information for anyone, next time you come across something, look at it through this lens. Is it being applied in this way? Are we comparing this is what Gen Z was like at age 25 versus what boomers were like at age 25? Or are we just taking surveys, giving it to both generations now, it's the 65-year-olds versus the 25-year-olds, and it's fascinating. Their perspectives and worldviews are different.
Yeah, no doubt.
So that's actually something that I had never considered, and I came across it in this research, so I wanted to make sure that we talked about it. We're going to do our very best when we make comparisons to do it in that way, but if and when we don't, it's perfectly plausible, reasonable for you to be a bit more skeptical of what we're saying.
Well, and that's exactly the thing, right? When I was in high school or university age, Gen Z age, my concern was on the forefront of what I was going through in life, which was like, where am I going to school? How am I going to move out of my parents' basement? Like, am I going to find a wife? How am I going to afford a car and a house and this, that, and the other? And once you go through all those milestones, you go to school, you find a wife, you buy a house, you buy a car. Then, like I said, you start having kids. Then my attention is on other things. For example, like right now, really conscious about the environment, teaching our kids about the environment. Yesterday, Asher was grabbing a spoon out of the drawer, and he grabbed like a regular spoon, like cutlery, and not a plastic one. He says, "This one's better for the earth, Dad." He's 3. And so like that's where my attention is right now because of the stage of life I'm in. So that makes total sense.
And understanding when you were in your formative years and what was happening in the world is also crucial to understanding how you view the world. We know that with perspectives about finances. So, I'm 17 years old in 2008 when the big financial crisis happens. Prior to a couple of years ago, we had never lived in a world where inflation was like in our vocabulary financially, because it had never happened, versus like our parents who once owned homes on mortgages with interest rates in the teens. And so they, in their formative years, are going to develop certain perspectives about money that are going to be different from us. And so often it's really just about what's going on during your formative years.
Yeah. Speaking of formative years. So my number 8, which was this one about the environment.
Sure.
So my number 9, speaking of formative years, and I'm curious, this might be our first point of contention. I have that Gen Z is on track to be the best educated generation yet.
My number 8, Gen Z is on track to be the best educated generation.
So maybe
we set it up this way to be contentious. So far, we're 3 for 3.
Look, this is interesting. All of these data points are interesting and have ramifications on the world we live in now and the world that Gen Z is going to build. Absolutely. But when it comes to education, in the last 10 years or so, I have seen the deprioritization of post-secondary education in a way that I could have never dreamt of.
What do you mean by that?
Well, it's just due to so many different things. Like there are so many opportunities for career jobs now that don't require post-secondary education. Consider the rise of the influencer for one. I went to school with a girl who on the internet goes by Lord DIY. And certainly there are listeners who know who she is. She is a YouTuber. She lives in LA. She has built her life on YouTube. And she was in film school at formerly Ryerson University, but now currently Toronto Metropolitan University in Toronto. She was in film school, I think, or studying there for something. And she started doing these DIY videos on YouTube. And she was the first person I knew to become an influencer, to get a job online. And I remember back then when she did it, all of us were in post-secondary education. She dropped out to do the YouTube thing. And I remember back then thinking like, that's no plan for longevity for life. And fast forward 10 years, look at her now. She's she's got products in Target. She's got a TV show with Disney. Like she's made. And that's on a large scale, but on a smaller scale, like there are so many opportunities to work in career jobs thanks to the internet, whether it's influencing or coding or whatever, things you can learn on your own through YouTube University, we mention all the time, where in a previous world, those opportunities just weren't available. And so I think it's relevant that Gen Z is on track to be the most educated generation of all time. But I do not think that education is good. I don't know. I just think that thanks to the internet and the means that we have for free education through YouTube University or even not education online, like through something like Masterclass or something, ways that we can teach ourselves that are unconventional. I'm not sure that that's super relevant.
Yeah, I mean, this is just anecdotal evidence, but there are 7 people in this building right now that work for a company that all have a degree that they're not really using.
Right.
This came from Pew Research, and we can frame it up a little bit. A look at older members of Gen Z suggests they're on a somewhat different educational trajectory than the generations that came before them. They're less likely to drop out of high school, more likely to be enrolled in college, and also more likely to have a college-educated parent. So in 2019, 44% of Gen Zers ages 7 to 17 were living with a parent who had a bachelor's degree or more, compared with 33% of millennials. So 33% for millennials, 44% of Gen Zers. Both of those trends reflect the overall trend toward more Americans pursuing higher education. And then if you think about what you were doing in high school, I worked at the local grocery store in the deli. You?
I worked as a lifeguard in the summers and didn't work too much during the school year.
So, interestingly, more people in Gen Z are becoming like you, except ditching the lifeguard part. Gen Zers are less likely to be working than previous generations when they were teens and young adults. Only 18% of Gen Z teens were employed in 2018. 27% of millennials were employed at that age. So again, we're comparing generations now at like the same age point. 41% of Gen Xers were employed at that point. So that's a trend that started with millennials, started with us, and is continuing even more with Gen Z. My number 7. Gen Z is roughly 20% of the US population. Where'd you have this?
My number 6.
My goodness. So this source is Statista, and this is data as of July 1st, 2022, released in March 2023. So what I found fascinating about this was of the 4 major generations, boomers, Gen X, millennials, Gen Z, and then Gen Alpha, number 5. They were almost like evenly split. And I don't know why that stood out to me as surprising, but I remember it did, and I wanted to share it because perhaps it's surprising to other folks. I think when generations are coming up, you assume that they are smaller because their influence is proportionally smaller than those that are older. I remember publishing 5, 7 years ago, a lot of content about millennials on our platforms. And I would talk about, hey, millennials have actually overtaken boomers in the workforce. And I remember that being like this big aha moment for a lot of people. And I think it's just because of optics. But there are just as many Gen Zs as there are millennials, and just as many Gen Zs as there are boomers.
So that accounts for 20% of the US population, accounts for 69 million people. So like you said, that was 2 years ago, the data released a year later. So this is like, I remember being a millennial when we were Gen Z age.
And everyone was like, here's the data on the millennials.
And the way people would talk about us, you know, like trying to reach the millennials, this up and coming generation. I was looking around like I felt a little belittling almost, especially once we got to be voting age and then home buying age. And it's like, why are we talking about us this way? We are such a huge representation of culture. We have voting power now. I have a mortgage. Like I have kids now. Why are we talking about us this way? And so I saw this in the 6th spot because it's just helpful to remind ourselves that this is such a large a large portion of the population, a large representation of the population, they're voters now, a large representation of the voting population. And it's not just this small little group of kids, if we tend to frame it that way. But my number 7 is related to this because my number 7...
Because you're not going to do 6 because I did your 6, so you're going to go back and do 7. Oh, see, my plan was actually for then just me to get to do my number 6, but I can see how that was not. Okay.
It's okay. My number 7 is that Gen Z is more racially and ethnically diverse than previous generations.
Ding, ding, ding. I got that number 3.
Wow.
Here we
wow.
go.
And so to me, these two were related because it makes me think about, okay, so 20% of the US population, and it gave me, these two stats married together gave me kind of a visual or a complexion of what that generation looks like. And I was so pleased to learn that they are more racially and ethnically diverse than any other generation. And what was fascinating is that they're actually a lot less, I don't have the stats in front of me, but compared to millennials, a lot of them, there were a lot fewer immigrants in Gen Z compared to millennials, but a lot more children of immigrants. And so when I think about Gen Z and how they contribute to the makeup of the country, right now the stats we're talking about are America, but we're in Canada, America's, northern little brother. And when I think about the complexion of Gen Z and how this generation, this makes up their 1/5 of the population, it's such a beautiful image, such a beautiful picture to me to close my eyes, and in my mind's eye see them as this mosaic of different shapes and sizes and colors and races and ethnicities. I just think that's beautiful. And that's the vision that I have for church and God's family, is just to see everyone represented. And so when I think about Gen Z, I love to think about them that way, looking different, sounding different, talking different, bringing different things to the table. Just
literally, all the food.
Yes. So talk to me about why it's in the number 3 spot for you.
Yes, number 3 spot. This data comes from Pew Research. Like you said, Gen Zers are a little bit less likely than millennials to be immigrants themselves, but considerably more likely to be the children of immigrants. Right. So 22% of Gen Zers have at least one immigrant parent, compared with 14% of millennials. This is American data specifically. Right. We have had some global web index data that would be the whole world. This is American specifically. And the Census Bureau projects that by 2026, Gen Z as a generation is going to be majority non-white. So that is a significant marker that I believe has not been crossed previously in America. Gen Z also represents the leading edge of the country's changing racial and ethnic makeup. A bare majority are non-Hispanic white, significantly smaller than the share of millennials who were non-Hispanic white, which was 61% at the same time. And 1 in 4 Gen Zers are Hispanic, 14% are Black, 6% are Asian, 5% are some other race or 2 or more races. So why do I have this so high? As it relates specifically to church, one of the things that stands out to me is simply this. If you care about being a Christian nation, this is going to be a big thing you want to support. Yeah. Because it's the non-whites that are going to church. It's the whites that are stopping going to church. Yeah. Which is fascinating because some of the not so pretty discourse online is like, we got to get the Christian nation back. And the implication is that the whites have to kind of step back in. I say, well, the whites, we're not really going to church the way that we used to, but the immigrants are. Yeah. Which is fascinating. And then I grew up in rural farming Canada. We were about as white as you can get. We're the potato capital of Canada. Wow. Like, we had a yearly festival. In my smaller neighboring village, we were the honey capital of Canada. Wow. And we had a yearly festival called Honey Fest. It was just delightful. Yeah. In the bigger, quote unquote, relatively bigger town, we had a potato festival. Want to venture a guess what we might have short formed that festival
Please
as.
tell me you didn't call it Pot Fest.
Indeed we did. Not like everyone called it. Like, that's what it was called.
Right. Yeah.
Jeez. There was one Black student in our high school class. So this is what's interesting. Growing up in a hockey nation, before the Raptors were popular, This is like 96, 97. The Raptors were a brand new basketball team in the city of Toronto. We were playing in the baseball stadium. So I grew up loving basketball because of my dad's influence. He did not like hockey. And I wanted to join a traveling basketball team, but there were none. Every single town had an ice rink, but there was no basketball team. So we had to drive an hour from where we lived in rural farming Canada to Toronto to play. And this was in 4th grade. And I was playing for the traveling rep team, the Mississauga Marauders. We were the 4th ranked team in Ontario. We went up against the 1st ranked Scarborough Blues in the semifinals, and they beat us. And I remember because on the other side was Corey Joseph and former Toronto Raptor and current Toronto Raptor as of this year, Kelly Olynyk, who was already 6'1" in 4th grade, dominating us. And I had such an amazing experience because that was the first time I was introduced to culture that wasn't mine. I was save for one, there was 2 white boys on that team, me and Greg.
Yeah, Toronto, one of the most multicultural cities in the world.
Absolutely. And so that was really formative. It changed how the clothes that I wore. It changed the culture and the music that I listened to. It changed the shoes that I wanted to wear. And when I would go back to, my home where everyone was white. No, Honey Fest. That wasn't high school just yet. Okay. That was to come. I didn't know what was on the horizon. That was enriching for me. And when I travel, and when you travel, and we get to see other cultures, it's enriching.
Absolutely.
The more that you get stuck in your single culture, and our culture has things to offer too. I'm not trying to take away from that.
Yeah.
But like the more cultures that you see, the more richness of the tapestry of the human condition and the expression of faith in different cultures, right? Like when you think about the Pentecostal culture that you and I grew up with, so much of that is influenced by Black faith.
Yes.
And there's a certain expression of that Pentecostal like latches onto. We don't get that from our expression.
Right.
But we get to like experience it through them. And that is something that is to be enjoyed and pursue and be grateful for. I think when people see this, I think because of maybe some of the xenophobic tendencies that we all have, like it scares us. And I want to push back on that and say, this is an enriching thing that is good.
Yeah, what a gift. Now I'm feeling a little guilty. I didn't put it higher on my list.
See, and that is something that we should consider, right? Like I think Alex saw that and was like, hey, not in my country.
Okay, so circle back and give me your
number 6.
6. Yeah, that was my 6. Your 3. Yep.
Gen Z is the least religious generation in American history. This comes from Religion in Public. And let's put some parameters on for this. No religious affiliation is defined as those that indicate their present religion is either atheist, agnostic, or nothing in particular. In 2022, 26% of boomers were nuns, 48% of Gen Z. Here's what's interesting. Beliefs in this case differ from involvement because it's Gen X, the forgotten generation. They're listening, they're watching. Why aren't you mentioning me? I'm about to mention you. Maybe you wish I didn't after I say this.
You might want to tune into another show.
It's Gen X that is in fact the least active religious generation in America. Both millennials and G attend church more frequently and serve more frequently than Gen X. And this comes from the citation, the source, quote, many of Gen X are reaching their peak in personal income and are being tapped to be leaders in all aspects of society. Yet, they are clearly not filling the churches, synagogues, and mosques each weekend. That could open the door for millennials and Gen Z to step up sooner for leadership roles. The reason I have this at number 6 and not number 1, which I think it would be fair if you heard me put it at 6 and be like, why is this not number 1? Is because this is a broad cultural trend that is not specific to Gen Z. If you look at the data that is linked here, you can see that every generation with each passing 3 years, each passing interval that this data tracks is becoming less religious. So this isn't something that we can pin on Gen Z. Sure, they're starting at a lower proportion of their generation being religious than previous generations, but they're becoming less religious at the same pace as millennials, as boomers, and hey, Gen X, come on, volunteer if you're not already. Go to church.
So I had this in the 5 spot, and it serves as kind of a runway to take 5 all the way through 1 for me. Like they're all kind of there's a thread.
Come on, you didn't attach a narrative to this.
there is a thread that's kind of woven throughout these last 5 data points that we're going to talk about. And I'm so glad you brought up there what you did about the fact that this is not unique to their generation, but it's a trend that's shared amongst all generations, and they're becoming less religious at the same pace as the rest of us, because that's what I was gonna. That's what I really gleaned from this data as well. It's like, okay, it's easy to read that statistic like in a silo and be like, oh, we sound the alarms or point the finger at someone to blame, and it's like, wait.
I made a carousel where the first slide is Gen Z is the least religious generation in American history. And everyone was like, no.
Yeah, everyone's like, I knew it.
And then I slide
those
through,
kids.
and it's, you know who it is? It's Gen X being like, yeah, they suck. And then they get to slide 8, and it's like, guess what, Gen X? And they're like, no, oh, it was a trap.
Yeah. So it's such a great opportunity to, I guess, look in the mirror for us millennials, Gen X, anyone listening to the show, and take a sober evaluation of the state of religiosity in the West. And thanks to all this data that we've collected here, you can see like all of us are on a trend heading in a certain direction. Gen Z is not alone in this.
But I think, and there's a big positive read on that, I believe, and I think this is where we can speak to this uniquely as Canadians, because we do not have the cultural Christianity that Americans to the South have.
Sure.
And if you want a positive read on this, it's to look at it and say, all of the folks that identify as Christian, but it's almost following Jesus in name only, are no longer identifying. And those that are left are the ones that, like, before it was the same amount, but you just had like, oh, I'm an American, I'm a Christian.
Sure.
So like, how much fewer is it? Perhaps it is way fewer. But if nothing less, what I've heard about Gen Z is, yeah, there aren't as many Christians, but the ones that we know, they really, really love Jesus.
Yeah.
And that's a great thing to take away. I mean, this isn't a perfect analogy, but it's like, hey, would you rather have like 5 friends that will like go to war with you? Or do you want to have like 100 people that are like, oh, I like that guy?
Yeah.
So I think you'd want like the 5 closer relationships. And there's something to be said about a smaller group that is on fire for God, that is truly dedicated to it. And if you look at the origin of the church, didn't take too many.
Well, thank you for that segue, because the next stat that I have in the number 4 spot is that Gen Z is becoming less religiously identified.
I had that at 5.
Each year passes, and so this is looking at how Gen Z self-identifies as far as religion goes. And so the data says that the share of Gen Z that has no religious affiliation is 48.5%. It seems statistically justifiable to say that by the time the U.S. has another presidential election, so that would be this year, half of Gen Z will identify as atheist, agnostic, or nothing in particular. So this is that phrase, the nuns we get, right? But here's the good news, and this is to what you were just saying. It's almost reminiscent of like some of the parables that Jesus taught about the wheat and the weeds, or like even the fact that his inner circle, the folks who really followed him, seemed to be like rather small. There were people there are these kind of throwaway lines in the Gospels that the Gospel writers were saying, be like, oh yeah, and after Jesus said that, it was too hard for people to hear, and so they fell away. You know, like they went back to like fishing or whatever, because they couldn't accept the call to follow Jesus. And so the statistics, the data continues and says, however, this study reports that the overall level of religious behavior amongst Gen Z, although a lot of them are identifying as nuns, the overall behavior in their religiosity is actually better than anticipated. It says that given their religious affiliation, in actuality, the religious attendance of Gen Z may be slightly higher than among the millennial generation.
Which speaks perfectly to the idea that those that are there really care.
Exactly. Yeah. So the data goes on and indicates that about 55% of Gen Z attend a religious service less than once a year, while 22% are weekly attenders. Compare that to millennials, where 57% attend less than once a year. So it's slight, but it's there, and 22% are weekly attenders. So there's not a significant, there hasn't been a significant decline using this metric, but you can see it there that the Gen Zers who do identify are participating in their religion, even a little bit more, a little bit better, a little bit deeper as far as the data goes than millennials.
Fascinating. Okay, my number 4. Gen Z spends 24 to 48 hours per month on TikTok. This comes from the Hootsuite 2022 Trends Report, and I have an update from the 2024 trends report.
That you
from
just kept in
Hootsuite.
your pocket?
Yeah, because I came prepared.
You're just revealing it now.
Yeah. Because I did research. I was in my bag.
Wow.
The percentage of Gen Z's online time being spent on social media is at an all-time high of 41%. So what that means is, we talked about this on a mailbag a few weeks ago, of the time Gen Z is spending online, more and more of that time is on social media. And that's likely because social media is no longer just about keeping up with friends and family. The definition of what social media includes is expanding. It now includes entertainment, and TikTok is a very big part of that. This comes from the report. While Instagram is their most used platform outside of China overall, TikTok is a big part of social media's growth. Gen Z's use of TikTok was rising an impressive 37% since Q4 2020, with 83% of Gen Z TikTok users saying they use the platform for entertaining, funny content. The app is clearly their go-to place for some light-hearted relief. One of the big pulls of apps like TikTok is also the ability to get real views or opinions from real people, making it more relatable. As a result, Gen Z are often going to TikTok before Google for advice about anything from finances, travel, or beauty trends. This is important. So now it's not just education, family and friends that social media is kind of eating up. It's also search. So the definition continues to expand. And then, according to research by Google, nearly half of young people look to Instagram or TikTok instead of Google Maps or search for answers, which is, of course, a big generational shift. 40% of Gen Z use TikTok for search instead of Google. That, again, was made by a Google VP. That was where the data was shared in a speech. Here's the 2024 Hootsuite Trends Report. Really interesting for me. It found that 91% of organizations are on Facebook, 86% are on Instagram, 62% are on YouTube, and just 29% are on TikTok. So this is important to me for two reasons. When social platforms are new, one of the draws to them is that they have not yet been infiltrated by capitalism and marketers. And so there's this organic and pure element to them. It's like, this is just people. No one is doing stuff for money. Corporations aren't doing it trying to get your attention to buy stuff. And that can only last for a couple of years. Because if it gains any momentum at all, eventually, all of us marketers and all the big brands are like, wait, we can monetize this. Let's go there. When I asked our audience of creatives that care about church and digital, because that's what we do, why would you watch otherwise? Just 10% of churches said that they were on TikTok, which I was like, that is concerning because of how much time Gen Z is on there. 24 to 48 hours per month spent on TikTok, and just 10% of churches are there. The only hope I have is that, well, only 29% as of 2024 organizations are there. So it seems like TikTok, which was the platform that ushered in this new discovery era of social media that we are all in right now, the best time to be doing social ministry. I understand if you are nostalgic as a creator, as a user, pardon me, for the old days, the good old days, but for a creator, a church, there's never been a better time to be doing social ministry. It was such a weird way of doing social that still now, 6 years later, very few churches and very few organizations are on it because they're like, we still don't know how to use this thing. But Gen Z, 24 to 48 hours a month.
Yeah, so that's why this is in my number one spot.
Number one! I'm like, you let me wind up for all that time.
Yeah.
And I thought you were looking at me a little funny.
Yeah.
You were looking at your own notes.
I need the editor to throw in like some air horns there and like a bomb dropping.
Well, did I do your number one justice?
You really did. You painted.
No wonder you cared I had another data point in my back pocket.
Yeah, you painted a really good picture because when I read the statistic, 24 to 48 hours a month online, which accounts for roughly 5% of your awake time, which is staggering.
Okay, that seems like a lot.
It was like, it's just like all of the implications of that, the ones that I know and even the ones I don't know, just kind of like unfolded before my mind's eye. And I was really taken aback by this statistic because I could have never guessed that the volume of attention on TikTok was that high. And we could compare like how much time are your Gen Zers spending on TikTok compared to how much time are they in church, and the disparity would be so laughable that we can't even go there. And the reason this is in my number one spot and I'm seeing this with not just Gen Z but people I know and love, my generation and older, the amount of time we're spending online, whether it's on TikTok or any of these other little apps to be entertained, is discipling us more than any other input.
Wow.
Your church, your preacher, your pastor has no chance at competing with this volume of discipleship. And it's just plainly like discouraging to me. And this is really unpopular to say on this show where we're like champions of the biggest communication shift in the last 500 years. And I really do endorse everything we talk about and like using this app and these phones to share the message, the story, the hope of Jesus. I'm all for that. But the sheer volume of input that we are receiving from these things, these apps, even if your church is on TikTok and doing great, it's one video in sequence of dozens of hundreds of others. And just by volume, we're losing this discipleship battle. There's this really fascinating piece called The State of Culture. It's published by this guy named Ted, Gioia. Good luck trying to say that last name. And every year he publishes this report, the State of Culture report. And he uses these visuals. I saw this on Twitter. Ironically, I spend more time on Twitter than any other social platform. But this is why, because I find really good nuggets of truth on there. And he talks about this thing that we talk a lot about how we're using these apps and TikTok in particular for entertainment. And he talks about the state of culture and the relationship between art and entertainment and such. And maybe we can put this graphic on the screen, but he's got this drawing and it's art like a little fish. And then there's a bigger fish behind art and it's entertainment. And then there's a bigger fish behind entertainment and it's distraction. And he's posing that like apps like TikTok in particular are transcending art and entertainment, and they're turning into distraction. Now his concern is there's a bigger fish behind distraction, but it's addiction. And this all has to do with our biochemistry and this thing that he talks about, and not just him, but this idea of dopamine loops. And how when there's a stimulus and it causes distraction, which TikTok really serves as a distraction for a lot of us, we get this dopamine release when we see something funny. When I send you a video on TikTok that is just objectively hilarious, we get this dopamine release, right? And that triggers this form of pleasure, whether it's laughter or if it's a cat video that inspires some warm and fuzzies, whatever it is. And so, of course, you have this desire for more. And so you keep scrolling to get more. And it's this reinforcement behavior. And then before you know it, there's this habit formation. When I'm feeling down or frustrated or anxious, I pick up my phone and I open TikTok and I start swiping because I know I'm going to get that predictable dopamine release. And that makes me feel good. It makes me forget what I'm going through, this, that, and the other. And then it becomes an addiction. And I hadn't thought about this report in a few weeks until I saw that number and that statistic. I was like, oh, we're addicted to this, to spend that type of time doing anything. Like, we're addicted to this. And it's because of this cycle, this pattern, this habit formation of dopamine releases. And Ted's kind of thesis here is like, what happens when dopamine drives culture? And so he gives a couple examples. He says with sports. So in a slow traditional culture, you play a sport. In a fast modern culture, you watch a sport. And in a dopamine culture, you gamble on the sport. Journalism, slow traditional culture, you read a newspaper. Fast modern, multimedia. Dopamine culture, it's clickbait, right? Whatever we can get out there to get people to click. Here we go, video. Slow traditional, film and TV, long form videos. Fast modern, videos, just regular plain old videos. Dopamine culture, reels, short videos, TikToks. This is true for music as well on TikTok, right? And so he goes on. He talks about relationships, courtship and marriage. Then there was, in a modern traditional culture, sexual freedom. And now it's dopamine culture. We're just swiping on an app, swiping across people's faces. And so that's the reason this one's in my number one spot, is because it sparks a whole lot of real like existential concern for me. And as a pastor, I feel that the angst of that losing battle, knowing that what we do on Sundays and throughout the week and whatever else in our churches has the potential to be really formative, but just based off volume, folks' habits are being formed by a dopamine culture that is just completely different than what we're trying to pursue in the presence of God at church.
It's interesting to see how even TikTok is trying to introduce different things that could fix this. Last year they introduced, I don't know if you've heard about this, the STEM feed. So STEM stands for science, technology, is it engineering and math? I'm pretty sure that's what it is.
Sounds about right.
So we have like STEM camps here.
Yeah.
Like my daughter goes to STEM camp in the summer. And they introduced a feed that was called the STEM feed.
Okay.
And the idea was like, if you click on that feed, similar to the following feed and the For You feed,
Oh, I have a memory of this now.
but it would like just be things that are meant to be nurturing
Right.
for your brain and educational and not just mindless entertainment. So that was like one effort that they made. And I think the big question that comes out of this is like, okay, what responsibility does a church and a Christian leader have if you are convinced that this is hurting people? Does that mean that you either work to be on it as a force of like redemption, or do you actively reject it
Right.
as almost like this prophetic statement
Yep.
that we're not going to be on it? And if folks come to different conclusions than me, that's perfectly all right. But I'm worried if churches flat out reject it, because it's hard to imagine them having any relevance in culture if you're just completely absent from that type of thing. Unless we are content with kind of really shrinking, because there are and historically have been pre-internet cultures that have been like, this technology is not for us. We're going to go and we're going to live in this place all by ourselves, and people will point at us and think we're strange because we're driving horse and buggies even though there are automobiles on the road. So that's an option. But what I think that churches have to offer that is so amazing in culture is this organization, this living body where we actually get together outside of work and outside of home. It's multi-generational. It's across all income levels, all age, all generation. We get together for a shared purpose. When we tell churches to be active on social, it's not because social is fulfilling the ultimate purpose of the church. It's an entry point for people to get connected to the church. And it is showing, hey, it doesn't have to be this way. You know, the creators that I follow on my social feeds are all basically being like, hey, here's like a challenge in your life. Here's how to solve that challenge. Like right now, one of the biggest weaknesses of my family, maybe because I'm an entrepreneur, maybe because it's like not my wife's like first skill set, is like we don't eat together enough as a family as much as I'd like. So one of my goals for this year was to do that more. So right now, I have curated my social feeds and they're just meal after meal. Like, you can make this at home and people will like it. And in the first few months, like my outrageously picky daughter said to me this weekend, Dad, no one in the world makes chicken like you. I only want your chicken. This this girl has only eaten like chicken nuggets her whole life. And now she's eating like chicken thighs with a brushed adobo pepper sauce. It was just adobo peppers blended in water.
She got the dark meat. She realized, I've been missing out.
She's like, this is different. This is crispy. Yeah, these aren't just like chicken guts rearranged and then deep fried. Praise God. I don't even need the sweet and sour sauce. And so social was introducing me to something new. Was the point of me following those creators to watch them making food? No, it was so I could make food. They were the entry point to their ultimate purpose being fulfilled in my life. And the church being active on social is meant to fill this, like, that same purpose. Get people connected to the gospel. Oh, wow, you're talking about something from scripture. There's wisdom here that is relevant to my life. And then you want to know more. So you follow them and you get connected to that church. And it doesn't always work like perfectly cleanly that way. Guess what? We also ordered McDonald's yesterday. Right. Like that still happens. You know, we are on a journey trying to get better as a family. And so it's going to be fascinating because this gets to my number one, which I won't reveal now, but does feel like some people believe we are headed to a point where culture is going to just say, you know what, enough. This digital has gone too far. And I'm really skeptical that that's going to happen. Not because I necessarily believe it's the right thing. I think sometimes folks interpret my stance on this is like, this is what Brady wants to happen. It's like, no, I really just am trying to say what I think will happen, and then how do we respond to what's going to happen. But I'm skeptical that there's going to be this come to Jesus moment where we as a culture are like, this has gone too far.
Yeah.
What number are we on?
I have read 5 and 4 from me, so 3 would be my next one. What's your 4th?
24 to 48 hours.
Okay. Yes, so you just read that one and I revealed it as my number 1.
And you did your 3.
No, not yet.
Okay, go ahead.
My number 3 is Gen Z is more likely than any other generation to report having a mental health condition, and almost 3 in 10 say they're prone to anxiety, a higher proportion than any other age group.
So that's my 2.
Yeah. And so these last 3 for me are just all intertwined. They're all interwoven. They're all related in the sense of like, what are the ramifications of having these devices in our pockets all the time and spending so much time having them before our faces as we do? And there is a myriad of reasons to be having a mental health crisis right now. But I know in my own life, as like a pretty mature person and pretty mature Christian, I know the influence that social media has on my anxiety. And like, I was just going to say that about you, like the way you trained your algorithm to teach you what you wanted to learn about your own personal life, that's the best use of these platforms like TikTok that are not just entertainment anymore. They're very useful. But the way you trained your algorithm that way is a very mature way to use that platform. And it's a maturity that I'm not sure like a lot of people have. So that's even part of the responsibility of those of us who are leading people in faith communities, is like equipping people. If we're going to choose not to pull out and like move to the woods and start milking our own cows, it's like, okay, we're all on TikTok. We know that. Our church is on TikTok. We know that. How do we use these devices and platforms responsibly in a Christian way? That's part of our responsibility as Christian leaders, as pastors, as youth leaders, as parents.
And if you're not on TikTok, you're not allowed to opt yourself out of this conversation, because TikTok ushered in a new era that every platform copied. So if you're like, that's why I'm not on TikTok, you're on Instagram. It's the same thing.
Yeah. And we're in the season of Lent right now, and inspired by the State of Culture report, I could see that I was having habits formed by TikTok. So I'm not on TikTok right now. And
for Lent.
Yes, and maybe forever. It won't be on my iPhone homepage ever again, I can tell you that positively. But I've noticed that I have the tendency to replace the dopamine cycle with another app. When I would normally be on TikTok, I was like, oh, well, I'll just go, like I never watch Instagram Reels. Like maybe I'll go watch Instagram Reels. It's like,
right. It's like, I'm not buying McDonald's, so I went to Wendy's. Like,
yes, exactly. And so what was I saying?
TikTok here is Taco Bell. They're like, at least I'm not a Taco Bell.
Which I have said on this show plenty of
Praise
times.
God for Taco Bell.
And so, yes, there are plenty of reasons to be having a mental health crisis during this season of our life in the West. But I find it no coincidence that we have the staggering statistic that Gen Z is more likely than any other generation to report having a mental health condition. And almost 3 in 10 said that they're prone to anxiety. I am not a political scientist. I can't draw the lines for you perfectly, but I'm confident that these devices and the apps that are getting so much of our attention are influencing our health of our bodies, of our spirits, of our emotions, and of our brains, of our anxiety. And so, yeah, it's not divorce. It's not divorced from my number 1. In fact, it's like it's very intertwined with my concern about just how much attention we're giving to these things.
So we did this exercise in an effort to see how we might differently rank them, and we basically did the exact number.
It's pretty darn close.
So let me present a different culprit to what you're describing.
Okay.
Not here to say that it's not a contributor, but I think there's
Might as well
another
stir the pot.
Yeah. I'm stirring the pot by being like, good point. I think you're right. But there might be another thing. People want to listen to podcast hosts that fight.
Yeah.
Yeah, well. Okay.
You're going to need another co-host.
That's true. That's true. It's a term called prevalence inflation.
Okay.
And the data that we cited this stat from is Global Web Index again. Highly recommend that everyone goes through this report. Tons of good stuff in there that we didn't include in this episode. This is from a study in Science Direct. The title of the study is called, Are Mental Health Awareness Efforts Contributing to the Rise in Reported Mental Health Problems? A call to test the prevalence inflation hypothesis. This is the thesis from this. Quote, first, we argue that mental health awareness efforts are leading to more accurate reporting of previously under-recognized symptoms, a beneficial outcome. Second, and more problematically, we propose that awareness efforts are leading some individuals to interpret and report milder forms of distress as mental health problems. We propose that this then leads some individuals to experience a genuine increase in symptoms, because labeling distress as a mental health problem can affect an individual's self-concept and behavior in a way that is ultimately self-fulfilling. What a fascinating experiment that we're doing on ourselves.
Yep.
we make progress because for so long we know what is a fact that people suffered in silence. So we make progress. And in that progress, we do what every human culture has always done. We swing from one end of the pendulum to the other. And that solution to the problem in the human condition created a new one.
Right.
That expresses itself in the same way that the problem we tried to fix was in the beginning.
Yes. Could be.
That's all you got.
I mean, it seems awfully plausible and yeah, I mean,
look, you're blaming phones. I'm blaming people that care about mental health.
Yeah. What was the phrase? Prevalence inflation.
Prevalence inflation.
We've
We've talked about this before.
yeah.
In relation to TikTok feeds. Remember when the brain eating amoeba was on the TikTok feed last year? And all you would see was people being like, don't go in water, you'll die.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh my gosh, like, am I going to die? And then I was like, wait a minute, no, this is prevalence inflation.
There's one person this happened to or whatever. And I know about it because I'm connected.
And everyone in their heightened, anxiety state is like, wait, maybe this could happen too.
Yeah.
Right? Like there's this trend on TikTok because it gets views. And this is like a different version of outrage bait where it's like, did you know that if you brushed with this toothpaste, like you should never brush with that toothpaste? Like, I'm literally trying to brush my teeth.
Yeah.
You're telling me that toothpaste is like, it's actually worse than not brushing at all.
Yeah.
You're like, okay, another thing I got to worry about. Another thing. It's always that because it drives views because there's nothing that gets our attention more than outrage.
Yeah. The example you just brought up about the brain eating amoeba is actually perfect because it illustrates both of these points. It illustrates the prevalency because when it was like one case or whatever, but it blew up on social and all of our algorithms were feeding it to us. But then on the other hand, what I'm suggesting is like, if we weren't on TikTok, we wouldn't have known about that. Like if TikTok didn't have as much of my attention, I wouldn't have known about the brain eating amoeba in the first place. And so a couple of weeks ago when we were in Punta Cana and we hiked to these beautiful freshwater lagoons, and I was like ready to jump in because I'm not prone to anxiety. Half the group was like, what about brain eating amoebas? And I'm like, y'all, this isn't something we need to be legitimately concerned about.
This is a fascinating revision of what actually happened because who was the first person to jump in that water?
You were.
It wasn't you.
You were.
It wasn't you.
That's true.
I was not afraid of brain eating amoebas.
I was afraid of the cold.
I disagree.
Okay.
This is good.
We're legitimately disagreeing.
Yeah,
Keep this going.
I mean, you literally lied about the lagoon, but that's fine. That's fine.
I didn't say I was first.
Everyone else was afraid of the
I said
amoeba.
half of the group. And I said half because it was mostly the women. But I didn't want to out them like that.
Crazy. That's crazy. The true colors come out. Real sicko behavior. I think there's something to like the heightened level of that happening. But before we had TikTok, we would just turn on the evening news.
Sure.
And then run 60 minutes. And 60 minutes would be like, your friendly kitchen knife, the knife that cuts your vegetables, is it actually the biggest threat in your home tonight on 60 Minutes?
Yeah.
And then you'd get to work the next day and be like, yeah, man, I realized the knife I had bought was actually going to be a threat to my family. So I threw it. And everyone's like, I saw that too. Did you get it?
There's no algorithmic element to that though, right? So you see it on 60 Minutes on
There
Tuesday night.
There is an algorithmic element.
But you see it once.
It's not a personal algorithmic element. But what happens when you talk about TikTok? Did you see that video I saw? We all see the same stuff.
Yeah.
Like there is a personal element to it, but news agencies have known ratings forever.
Sure.
And they're purposefully choosing things to get us to watch and to get us to experience the identical symptoms, which is why I'm agreeing that there is a new element to it. It's like every generation, it's like we take the same thing and we ratchet it up a little bit more. And then we put the full blame on the newest expression of the thing that the previous generation championed and had their own bad version of.
Yeah, that's fair.
It's bad that it's worse.
Yeah.
But people were scared of newspapers. People were scared of books.
Yeah.
They did not want
Still scared
people
of
to have
books.
books.
Yeah.
That's true. The Oscar, ABC's of book burning.
Yeah.
So I think all we have left is my number one, which is your number two.
That's right.
98% of Gen Z worldwide own a smartphone. So,
I couldn't believe this.
well, let's provide some parameters. This comes from Global Web Index again, because it's somewhat misleading in that what they're saying is our figures are representative of the online populations of each market. So if you are online and Gen Z, Worldwide, 98% own a smartphone.
Okay.
So that's not the total population of Gen Z.
Sure.
It's the total population of Gen Z who's online.
Okay.
They say in many markets in Latin America, the Middle East and Africa, and the Asian Pacific region, low internet penetration rates can mean that online populations are more young, urban, affluent, and educated than the total population. Not everyone's online.
Mm-hmm.
So this is the percentage of internet users ages 16 to 20 who own a smartphone worldwide of all the continents. Guess which of the continents are the highest. They're both 99%.
That's wild. I'd say South America and Africa.
Middle East and Africa.
Okay.
99%. Now, North America's 96%,
Sure.
Europe's 98%, Asia Pacific's 98%,
Yeah.
Latin America's 98%. This gets to the question that I had. There is this prediction that we're going to hit this tipping point, that we're going to all collectively decide that we've had enough. We've seen the negative effects on culture. And I think that is really of the moment thinking. I see AI coming in. I see the biggest company in the world be like, we finally figured out wearables. We saw a person with the Apple Vision Pro coming home from the retreat,
That guy looked crazy.
sitting in a crowded terminal, doing who knows what.
Who knows what? That's the worst part.
Filming us.
Yeah. But he had the eyes on, so we could see his eyes.
Well,
Yeah.
how generous of him.
Yeah.
And so I think that this is only going to get deeper. I think this is only going to keep happening. Now, it wouldn't surprise me at all if we do see certain populations, sects of culture, go the way of the Amish or the Mennonites. Like, you know what? We're stopping here. We will not go any further. And I am very interested to see what we do differently with Gen Alpha. My children, my oldest, I think, would be Gen Alpha.
Okay.
My youngest is probably going to be in her own generation. She's, not even 2 years old yet. So there are 7 Pro Church Tools kids under 2. They're all going to be in their own generation. And then my oldest, Lily, will be probably in Gen Alpha, but she might be kind of like, right on the cusp. We have data now. We know giving smartphones to kids early is just like one of the worst things that you can do. And it's disproportionately worse to be on social for teenage girls, right? So I've talked with many parents that have teenagers, and they talk about how like you almost have to create groups of parents that collectively agree we are not going to give our kids smartphones, because if you're the one, it's almost just as distressing
Totally.
as being the one that's left out than if you actually have the social media on your phone. My guess is that by the time my kids reach teenage years, we'll have gone through one generational cycle of this that will be aware, the data will be clear, and will culturally have figured out a little bit better of an approach. Maybe not everywhere, but I'm confident, at least right now, and perhaps this is naive, but we have data now, and I talk to my parents that have like kids that are 9, 10, 11, 12, they're like, yeah, no, not until at least this age. Oh yeah, 16, no way. Like no younger than that. Like it's going to be 16, and even then it's going to be like policed to this level. It's going to be like monitored to this level. And then I think about like, what's it going to be like for those kids? Like, are they going to feel like they live in like this nanny state? Is that going to be a thing where they talk about my parents, like they knew about the text that I was on? But, we have these new platforms like, Messenger Friends, Messenger Family. It's like Facebook Messenger where you can only get it if both parents exchange a secret code that allows their kids to text. So that way, like a kid can't just text their friend unless the parents meet. So even tech companies are evolving and trying to introduce better things. But what we have started, I do not see slowing down.
Yeah, I just don't know like a path to regress, right? Like if we look over the course of human history, like any major breakthrough in technology, whether it's like communication or medication or whatever, it's like the progress always moves forward, and there's pushback along the way for different breakthroughs and this, that, and the other. But like we're culturally, like you said, maybe there will be small groups that will retreat to the mountains and start making their own cheese, but like culturally, we will not revert back, I don't believe. I don't see a way with the way technology is integrated with everything we do in the modern world. But I do know that I'm feeling like, I'm showing my age now, but like I'm feeling like I'm hitting my own ceilings of like, oh yeah, like, I'll probably always buy the newest smartphone. I like having that in my pocket. I like the cameras and this, that, and the other. But like when it comes to augmented or virtual reality, like that's just really not something that I'm interested in, and can't see a path towards me being interested in. That feels like a step in a direction too far for me. So I see where now I'm getting old enough where I feel like I may start drawing some lines with how far I personally wade into the waters, but culturally it's like I totally agree. I don't see a way to go backwards. And so that's the question that we ask ourselves introspectively on this show all the time, is like, this is the world we're living in. We are living in the wake of the biggest communication shift in the last 500 years. And it's good, it's bad, it's ugly. And the question before us is, how do we live as faithful Christians, first and foremost, just personally, like Brady offline, Alex offline, like not on the mics. How do we live as faithful Christians first? And then how do we as Christian leaders, and so for the folks listening to the show, like how do we faithfully follow Jesus in a digital age, using these digital means to share the greatest story ever told? It's the question before us every time we sit down to record the show. It's the question that we ask ourselves every time we walk through the doors at 9 a.m. in this office. It's like, how do we faithfully do this as Christians? And sure, there will be missteps along the way, but in this sense and in so many others, like I believe that God is a God of like forward motion, forward progress. And so how do we continue to walk forward following him faithfully through a digital age? It's not easy, and there certainly is no roadmap, but you only get anywhere by taking one step at a time. And so you interrogate those steps along the way and ask yourself, am I doing this faithfully to Jesus? And if so, then like, onward, Christian soldier.
Onward, Christian soldier. Beautiful cap on a mildly distressing episode.
Yeah, it got hot in here.
I think that a lot of what we're describing has parallels with the Academy Awards Picture of the Year, where you build this bomb and then, Oppenheimer's like, maybe we could stop now. And then he's like, we don't need to do anything else. Mm-hmm. And then, one of the other lines in the movie is until somebody builds a bigger one. Mm-hmm. And then suddenly we all have enough nukes to, blow up the world how many times over. It's, you open that up, that Pandora's box, and you're right, we don't stop. It's like, wait, this weapon exists, this phone exists. Well, that means that we can exploit humanity, and that means that we can do great things with it. It means we can do terrible things with it. So yeah, mildly distressing. I probably should have stopped talking. You had a great cap. Onwards, Christian soldier, and then I was like, soldier, bomb, Oppenheimer. Thanks as always for your time, attention, and trust. We'll talk to you next week.
It's interesting.
Yeah, it's the whites. It's always the whites, people. It's always, you got to look in the mirror and ask yourself, why, God, why?
Yeah, that's right.